Thank you for coming to the panel late. I know that it's late. You could be at the costume contest or various things, so I appreciate you, coming out to the panel. This is playing God, creating worlds and all that stuff. So we'll do a quick intro. Gina, why don't you start on your end?
Hi, I'm Gina. Right under the name D.B. Kennedy. I've written future tense, present, and intensity.
Gotta hold up the book, Gina. So
Oh, sorry.
I'll be your fan.
Look at the book.
Look at the book. Look at the camera. Hold it to the camera.
Why?
Lovely artwork done by Kenny.
Yeah,
And artwork by Kenny Calderon this year.
Not Kenny Calderon, it's just Kenny.
Just Kenny.
Kenny.
Like Ronnie the Evil.
Like Ronnie the Evil.
He's like Shay.
All right, so
I'm E. Robert Dunn. I'm E. Robert Dunn. I write science fiction. I've been writing since I was 14. I'm also a playwright and a screenwriter. My book series, should I do that too?
Yeah.
I'm getting better.
I got the microphone.
Thank you, Holby, thank you. Is Echelon's End. There are 13 books in the series, but 2 are available right now. More will be available once Phil takes control of my life. That makes everything pretty.
yeah, exactly. So all right. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is P.L.McCall II. I've been doing the con scene and the self-publishing scene for over 12 years now. I also recently got signed to an agent, so what that means is, yes, you can achieve the dream if you keep going. And it takes a lot of perseverance and a lot of, trial and error and try again and re-rinse and try again.
And believing in yourself.
And believing in yourself, right? And having a great supportive team. That
And having
helps
people
too.
say no, no, no while you're thinking yes,
Yes, exactly. So I'm the author and creator of the Grace Flame Chronicles. You can see it here. And this book is the book that got me signed, and it is currently being looked at for production on one of the streaming services. So there we go. So tonight we are talking about playing God and creating universes. So how many of you are writers in here? Let's see, show of hands, or want to be writers? Anyone? As a profession, a hobby? I mean,
For fun, yeah.
For fun. Yeah, okay.
Or speculative.
We're speculating to be one. The good news is that it can be done, and it can be a lot of fun, and it can be something enjoyable. It can also be therapeutic in some ways. So please, if you're considering it and it's a hobby, or you want to make it into something, just keep trucking along and complete your work. That's most important. So let's get some questions. Does anyone have any questions about world building, how to create worlds? It could be for your gaming world. It could be for your novels. It could be for your role-playing games. It could be for pretty much anything. So this is playing God and creating worlds, and we're opening the floor to questions.
God's also just.
Yeah.
When you're making a world, how back into its history do you start to where you can build upon its current society? And that sounds like a loaded question.
It is a loaded question, and the correct answer is you kind of build enough information so that you have enough information to start, and then as you go along, you just take really good notes, right? The problem is a lot of writers tend to start out trying to create the world and really create all the backstory, and then what happens is they spend most of their time working on backstory and not working on their book.
Right. You're not telling a story.
You're not telling a story. You're basically creating an encyclopedia, which is what you don't want to do, right? That doesn't mean fly loose in the wind. You definitely have a half-the place to start. I like to use the analogy of you're going to plant a garden. So, you dig the holes, you put the seeds in, you add the water, and you wait and see what happens, right? And you tender it, and you take care of it, and eventually it will yield fruit or vegetables, whatever it is. So, and keep in mind that when you start, so you have a basic idea, like, okay, this is my world, this is how it works, this is how everything interacts. It may change, right? And you need to be prepared for that. But there is Orson Scott Card, who's a famous writer. He has said many times over that if your tables float in the beginning of your book, you better have a damn good reason why they're not floating at the end of the book. And that is very good advice, because its consistency is key. So yes, definitely, pull your ideas together, but keep them loose, because the characters and the world will surprise you. Let's move to our next question. Anyone?
Have you yourself ever experienced Deus Ex Machina in your story, which is you just do something to move the story along with no explanation.
Yeah, so I caught myself doing it, and then I made sure I went back and stopped myself, because that is some really bad stuff to get caught in, and it's hard to avoid because you're trying to rush through the story, and there's been some times I've caught it, and I go back and say, well, there you should really not do that, and when you're cheating the reader, go back and figure it out. Stop trying to find a shortcut. So we look for shortcuts as people, but try to avoid that. I mean, the best example that I always give in a panel is that many of you have read the Harry Potter stories, and they're fantastic stories, but that car, and I think it was the Prisoner of Azkaban.
No, I'm sorry, it was the
It was the third book,
Chamber of
right?
Secrets.
Chamber of Secrets. There you go. So there's the car in Chamber of Secrets that in the beginning of the book is trying to kill Harry, and then when Harry ends up in the forest surrounded by all those spiders and he's about to die, suddenly the car goes da, 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 and it shows up and gets them and takes them away and then saves them. And really, JK, really, how did that happen? Like, the car was gone and we assumed it was gone, and then it wanted to kill them, but suddenly it knew that Harry was in the forest, it knew that Harry was in trouble, and it saved Harry. And then after it saved Harry, it went away and it crawled over the hill and never saw it again. So, I think what happened is that she was on a brilliant run, and she got to this point where she put Harry in a harrowing situation, and then said, oh no, how do I get him out? And then she's like, oh no, I've got a deadline. And then, she kind of wrote this thing and said, oh, I'll use the car. And the car was used, and as we read the book, I mean, even when I read it, I read through it, I was like, wow, the car showed up, and I kind of forgot about it. I kind of moved on because I'm more anxious to get to the next chapter, to the end. But after I saw the movie and I kind of reread it, I was like, yeah, it's kind of cheesy. The car kind of showed up out of nowhere. So, again, even famous writers can do it. That's what, to your point. It just doesn't need to be any.
And I think it's impossible to tell a perfect story.
Exactly.
It's
Just tell a story and tell it as best you can.
It's not going to be perfect.
There's always time to edit.
Yeah.
So, questions? Yes, Justin.
How do you approach technology? You're using more old world technology,
Right.
and some of your books are just a future that's I still haven't even thought about. And with Star Trek and things like that, how are you pushing technology in your stories?
Research as much as I can what is next generation for us becomes kind of not old hat but standard in my story for the people that I write about. I do get caught up in technobabble because I write science fiction.
Right on.
So that's one thing that I do. I also read other things like in Psychology Today about the mind, and then I put things together. Sometimes I just imagine what would make my life easier. It would be nice to have a fully automated home. So you have a computer you call companion, or something like that.
And the important thing too is that whether it's science fiction, whether you're pushing new technology or working with old technology or whatever it is, research is key. Now, there's two things you need to remember about science fiction that someone told me a while ago. Is that you have hard science fiction, and then you have soft science fiction and space opera. And that's a little bit different, right? So you can kind of get away from stuff. So what's an example? Well, 2001 is kind of hard science, and Star Wars is kind of fluffy science, right? The problem is with hard science is that unless you have a scientist on speed dial, you need to be careful.
Yeah.
Because the fans of hard science fiction will drag you across the coals several times.
For sure.
That's
Yeah.
what my glossary came to be about.
Yeah. So you
So I
gotta.
have to explain things that I created.
All right.
Yeah. And,
There's a wonderful book called Biomimicry, and it's what got me started about in my world. I think whenever you create a world and you're creating science, you have to create a philosophy of what that science is. In my world, the science is based on biology. So they believe instead of conquering the world, they are stewards of that world, and they must be in harmony with that world. So all of their technology is in harmony with biology. And in this book called Biomimicry, it talks about how we can have everything we want today if we just look at nature, right? So for energy, so if we just look at a leaf, it's a proton, it's a photon harvester, right? So why can't it's proton, not photon, proton harvester. So why can't we make all of our roofs that same way, and then they clean? It creates oxygen, hydrogen, and water. So we would create our water, we create hydrogen for fuel and oxygen to breathe. So we could have this green environment for energy and have all the energy we want. It talks about how to make a computer if you just map the brain. The only danger is if the brain dreams, would your then computer dream?
and
Right.
therefore one is dreaming.
And then come the questions, and then come the stories, right?
Right. So
Why
that's
is the
Right.
computer killing?
well,
Yeah,
that's kind of what I did. Is you have to make a decision when you're building a world. It is your world. So are you making like a Tolkien? You know, are you making it steampunk? Are you making it whatever? And then from that, I think your research then will guide you
What's
to the
story?
technology that
Yeah.
fits that world.
Right.
Does that make sense?
So research, research,
you're right on.
research.
You know, and I read. I'm an avid reader. I mean, you talk about when you were kids. I mean, I literally read encyclopedias.
Yeah.
And some
So-
stuff is just
Definitely done that.
inspirational.
The glasses.
Yeah.
They're not just for show.
Yeah.
Shells.
I'm an avid. I think to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, reader equals writer.
Yeah.
And people go, who's your one favorite author? I don't have one favorite author. I have many favorite authors because I like to have a 360-degree view
You.
of my worlds, using other people, not using them, but being inspired by other people and how they create their worlds, and then that keeps me in center with my world. So I read a lot of people.
You have to do your research. You have to read as much as you can. That's important. Let's get to another question. Yes, Mike.
How much description would be too much description?
Don't spend 2 or 3 pages
Yeah.
describing.
Well, I don't know.
So, again, it's in the context of your storytelling. It's how important it is to the story. Some authors are more wordier than others, and that's not a mortal sin, but what you have to be careful of is that if you lose the reader along the way. So, Stephen King is the master of saying a whole lot of stuff in over-describing and saying nothing, right?
Yeah.
But there are people that love that type of exposition. It's not for everybody.
Even Asimov does that.
Yeah, Asimov does it too.
Goes on and on and on.
So,
it's like it's just a water bottle.
yeah,
Right.
exactly. It's just a
I-
water
Okay,
bottle.
Dick does
My
it.
Philip K. Dick does it as well.
My
So-
philosophy when I write is, what does the reader need to know?
Exactly.
And I try to stick with that.
If you're more fantasy, you don't have to describe as much, but like I write science fiction, so I'm creating something that you've never seen before. And I tried, one thing I learned when I was in school, try not to always make it too earthy
Yep.
if it's not.
Right.
So if I'm trying to create something, don't say, well, it's just like a,
Don't do
don't say it's like a salt shaker, because it's not.
It's not.
You
Right.
know, and so so that's how I get wordy, but I break it up with dialogue sometimes.
Which I think
where
helps,
where in
yeah.
the scene I'm putting it. So if there was one scene where I have one of the characters, he's walking from his office to a meeting, and as he's walking to his office, he walks by a bank of viewports, and he sees the ship that he's going to command docked outside. Well, I describe that ship, but I'm also describing the noises around him, also the busyness that's around him, and then the yogi's like, sir, we've got to go. So I break it up with that, because if you get into these
Yeah.
blocks of description,
Blocks of description, you'll lose the reader.
then you're writing a technical manual.
Yeah.
So again, it goes back to the old saying, show, don't tell,
Right.
right? So, you had a question, yes.
How much culture is too much culture to insert into a world?
So the secret in culture is one rule. Do not make fun of the culture that you're insulting, you're inserting, right?
Yeah, stereotype.
Stereotype, do not stereotype.
Or
So-
it becomes about the culture now, not about the people of the
Right.
culture.
Well,
So-
is the culture integral to your story? That's the real question.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if it
Because-
is, then yeah, but if it's not, no.
Right.
Like if you have a story about something else, and then you start flooding the story with culture for no reason.
So example, the Pandora, the story of Pandora, Avatar. That was heavily about the two cultures colliding, so that
Right.
was very important for the story. Yes, it was Pocahontas in space, and that's fine. But again, we said it in the other panel, every story's been told before. So you're just telling your version of the story with characters that you create, and your characters are important. And to your point, a world is important and a culture is important, and they're also characters. And so we mentioned Tolkien, right? So the hobbits have a very specific culture that's defined to them. The elves have a very specific culture that's defined to them. The horse lords have a very specific culture that's defined to them. But Tolkien doesn't beat you over the head with the culture, right? He essentially, it reveals itself as the story moves
As the
along.
journey moves along, bits of it. It's like Dorothy on the Yellow Brick Road.
Road, yeah. As she moves through Oz, you know, you see the other
Scarecrow, and
parts.
then there's the forest with the Tin Man, and then there's the woods with the Cowardly Lion, and then there's poppies. Poppies will make them sleep. And then there's the Emerald City. So you see the different aspects of a culture.
As you move through the world, right?
Does that make
So,
sense? You
yes,
really
go ahead.
little.
When you're making a believable world, what do you think comes first, the culture or the history? Does your history influence your culture, or do you make up an idea of like what would your society be like, and then bring your history from there?
So I think, again, these are great questions, beautiful questions.
Yeah.
And the thing is that the best answer to that question is you do what works for your story best. So there's no right or wrong way to make a cake, right? You can make a cake different ways. You can have a chocolate cake, vanilla cake, pumpkin cake, and you know, all of these things. I just made everybody hungry. So essentially, you know, at the end of the day, creating a book is like creating a recipe or something like that. There's going to be elements that you're going to change. So in other words, the reason why that's a good saying is because everybody knows how to make scrambled eggs, hopefully, right? So, but there's people that do things differently. Some add milk, some add a little butter, some, you know, add salt and pepper, some put Tabasco sauce. Does it mean that you did the eggs the wrong way? No, what it means is you put your interpretation on it. So that's the same way a story is. So when you're talking about cultures, you're talking about histories. When you're creating your story, and how does it get you to the end of your story?
And I'd also say, is your story a cultural story or is it a historical story?
Exactly.
So if it's historical, then obviously the history is more important than the culture. If it's more of a cultural thing than the history, you could pepper it in to maybe justify the culture of their belief systems.
And one of the things that I want to mention, it's very important, is that we all tend to focus on characters. We focus on the hero, the villain, the sub-characters, the heroine. We tend to focus on those as characters. But in world building, the world is a character as well. And that's what a lot of people forget. The character of the world kind of gets diminished. And you would say, well, how's that possible? Well, if I would throw out words like, you know, Mirkwood, the Enterprise, you know, the Death Star, you know, Hogwarts, all of these things are going to put images in your mind. Why? Because they're characters. They may not be alive, but they're characters.
And they have their history, they have their culture. Those are personality traits of a world.
Don't
get me started on that.
Vulcans have a very specific culture, and we all know what that is if you've seen the show. And when I say that, it draws up imagery. So, and if you also say, like, if you're a Tolkien fan, you say something like Dwarven Society or something like that, you kind of get it, you know? So it's important that, one, you know the difference between Star Wars and Star Trek. So that's important. And then the other important thing is that you make sure that when you're not making fun of any culture or any religion, and you do have a solid basis for what you're talking about. There's nothing wrong, because guess what? We're all going to borrow from history. We're all going to borrow from historical figures. We're all going to borrow from other stories. The point is I can't tell you enough how important it is that you tell a good story, you finish that story, and you have believable characters and believable situations. And the way that you get believable situations, Gina said at the beginning, is consistency. So if things happen a certain way, they happen a certain way. And if they don't, then as Orson Scott said, make sure that they do have a reason why. So if you follow that rule, you kind of avoid a lot of pitfalls, and it should be okay. Let's get another question, because I want to make sure we get everybody's question. Yes?
How do you guys, if you do, put in religion into your books? Like, where is it that you see that there's a good opportunity to bring up faith or religion?
And again, it's part of like, what story you're telling.
No, yeah, I
No.
know.
Right.
I'm asking if like there's like a specific example that you can give.
So
that you've done.
my book, the Dr. Deus Devil's Army, it revolves around that there is a secret society called the Veil. And the Veil is actually the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic Church founded the Veil, and the Veil was founded by vampires. So I'm insinuating in this alternate universe that Christ was a blood titan and passed a genetic vampiric marker to the disciples through a blood ritual. And then I'm using analogies to the Bible, like when Christ says, go forth and spread the good news, that they're actually going forth and creating other vampires. So it's that type of stuff, and it's shocking, right? But, it is a blood ritual, and, and it continues forward. So when people go to church, there's a cross in the back of the church. And I like to do my research to make sure everything makes sense. So when people go on Sunday and they celebrate and they have adulation, that all of that adulation and that energy gets absorbed by the cross at the back of the church. Then at night there's a midnight mass and all the vampires come with their crucifixes and the energy through a ritual is passed to them. So then they don't need to feed on blood. So this is how they get away from feeding on blood. But there are still vampires that choose to feed on blood. Hence the veil is created. The veil is a way to stop other supernaturals from attacking human beings, because they figured out you kill humans, humans kill what they fear. So their numbers are smaller. So there's a lot of religious undertones in the book, and in fact the next book is called Vatican's Vampires. So I'm not straying from it, but I'm making sure that when I tell a story, it makes sense. So if you're going to mess with religion, or you're going to mess with mysticism, or you're going to do something, do yourself a favor and make sense of it. Like when a lot of people heard that Christ was a vampire in my book, and I'm not the first one who's ever made Christ a vampire. He's been a vampire many times before me. Essentially,
He's been an alien.
yeah, I've been an alien. He's been an alien too. So the important thing is that I made sure that it made sense. So as I move through my story, when I talk about the transmutation of the vampire genetic gene to the disciples, and the disciples spread it forth, and all of that stuff, it makes sense. And I'm not vilifying Christ. Christ was a blood titan from another place that came to our world, and all the gods in my world came from another place. They all came from the same society. But he realized that the blood ritual was a bad thing, and taking blood from people to gain power was bad. So that's why he kind of created this whole genetic marker thing, and then the church changed. And so you got to research. You can't make fun of it. I'm not making fun of the religion. I'm just saying, in an alternate universe, X happened. Right?
If you read The Handmaid's Tale, it's a great example.
Example, yeah.
Whenever church and state become one, and the dangers that lie within that when you have an oligarchy that's based on theology. Meaning, so again, research and study. I've done, like in my books, I have what they're called the echelon, but they don't have a religion, because I looked after the Japanese jiu-jitsu and the whole study of martial arts. That's kind of like their religion, but it's not a religion, it's a philosophy. And then when my culture comes, my characters come in contact with another culture that is ruled by a very fear-based theology, where they worship gods, and the gods, say that you must do this and you must do that, and there's a clash between cultures, because their religion doesn't know that's ridiculous, that you believe that, they believe that, so there's a clash with that. So that's some way that you can use religion, having different perspectives. I mean, go look at the Catholics and the Protestants. You've got so much there just to learn from. You could hear that in anything.
In anything, and you could bring it up in any story, And
so our Earth history is riddled with religious examples.
History, religion, mythology. Guess what they all have? They all have conflicts, and that's really what you're going for, is the conflict. Now, it was funny because I was telling Eston and Gina at one point, I actually have a relative who's actually in the church, and I told him about my book because he asked. We never talked about it, and he was a bit shocked. Well, there was the shock, but then after he kind of got over the shock, he thought about it for a second and said, it is a fantasy book, and it kind of makes sense.
Like Abraham killed vampires.
Yeah, Abraham killed vampires. It kind of made sense.
Abraham Lincoln, the vampire slayer.
Yeah, the vampire slayer. Yeah. So. Again, don't be afraid to push the buttons. Just when you do, just make sure you're not making fun. Right?
Yeah.
So, questions? Yes.
What happens when you do, like, for example, like with Marvel Universe, where they have different universes and then they combine them in the Avengers? How do you determine what laws then can happen wherever they go?
So Marvel and DC are like interesting animals. Like they're constantly reinventing themselves, and a lot of the times that they bring things together, they just don't mesh. So Robert and I had a long discussion because the Graceland universe is pretty big. There's a lot of things going on, different universes and stuff. And it really takes some thinking through it, because you've got to kind of make sure you're not like shooting yourself in the foot.
Find common denominators between the universes and make that your foundation.
A lot of it is mathematical.
It's mathematical, and really just finding out how the pieces fit together.
And they must have some things in common, because it's like even with Marvel, there are some commonalities within those different variations. you have to find what those are, and I think that's what makes it more cohesive and makes more a story that has continuity in it.
Yeah.
Right. So
Well, even with those crossovers that you're talking about, they still have to break the rules.
Yeah.
yeah.
So they'll put characters who don't exist in the comic and canon together with each other in different variations. And you'll get the super crazy nerds that'll be like, no, that's not right, and they'll be furious. And everybody else will be like, that is so cool.
So, the best answer to that is just, try to keep your world together, and you're going to mess up. It's going to happen. But if you can recover from it and make sense of it, that's where it counts. So don't try to get too caught up in it. Just realize that, it will happen. You just need to be prepared for it. Yes, questions? Anybody? Come on, I know you guys. Yes, in the back.
How about, like they were saying, DC, how about when you make a character who literally acts like a god and kills whoever he wants? Like,
so that's
what
that's
DC's doing with the Doomsday Clock, with a certain Dr. Manhattan.
So the problem with villains or heroes that get godlike is that they become uncontrollable in your writing. So if you've noticed, the greatest example in the DC universe of somebody who got way out of control was Superman. Okay? Superman started off just being able to run fast, faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. He didn't fly. Did you hear flying in there? No, he didn't fly. So they started adding powers to Superman, adding stronger, laser eyes, breath, And then finally one writer sat down and said, he's a god, right? So then, kryptonite, right? It wasn't the greatest solution, but it worked, right?
Well, there are examples of things like that ruin a series. Has anybody here seen Heroes? The show Heroes?
Yeah.
Okay, so who remembers the Siler arc?
The Siler arc, yeah.
So this guy, it was an amazing first season. So he's getting power after power after power, but at the end of the show, at the end of the season, you're like, what the hell can't this guy do? And then you got two guys, one who absorbs powers and another one who steals powers, and they're going up against each other, and it's like, where can you go from there?
And they didn't recover from it.
Yeah, Tim Kring was like, I can't write any more of this crap.
It's done. You finished. You walked away.
House of Cards was the same thing. I mean, we've all seen House of Cards on Netflix, right? Seasons 1 and 2, Kevin Spacey, Underwood was incredible. The perfect villain, clawing himself up and up and up. And when he finally reached the high seat, what did they do with him? What do you do with a guy once he's reached the top?
You tear him down.
Well, yeah,
exactly. You tear him back down, and that's how you continue the story. Because everyone who rises, so every hero or villain who rises, they will eventually reach the mountaintop. And when they do, they're changed forever, and then they go back down a different person. Or they rise up again. So to give you an example of that, like when I wrote this book, Grace starts off as a villain. The whole idea is by the end of the book, she's a hero. So basically, she's torn down in the beginning of the book. She's in prison. You can't get any lower than where she is at that point. And then she rises from that, thinking she's going to accomplish X. But then in that rise to do what she wants, a personal thing, then she eventually becomes a hero unknowingly. We talked about that in the previous panel, that your heroes become heroes begrudgingly and unknowingly. Because nobody starts off being a hero. Even Superman really didn't start off being a hero. Spider-Man is the best example. He had no intentions of being a superhero. He was going to get a star and fame, and and he ended up being a hero. And there's plenty of them. Incredible Hulk is another one that he probably didn't want to be a hero, but he ended up being a hero. There's other characters like who are taught lessons, right? So Thor, if you look at Thor's line of thinking, right? Thor was already a hero, right? But then he got stripped of his rank and changed and altered. He was punished, and he had to. Thor's story is a redemption story. It's not about him being a hero, because he already was one.
Well, Spider-Man is the same, man. He was screwing around with his powers, and then he didn't stop this guy from killing his uncle.
So let's get to.
Are you seriously talking about the same guy who made a deal with the devil?
So we're at 8 o'clock. We got 30 minutes. So let's get some more questions in. Questions? Anyone? Come Come on, I know you got a question. Heroes, villains, publishing, yes.
I'm actually trying to write my first book.
Okay.
And in my story, there's magic, fantasy, steampunk. How would you like mix all that together?
Okay, so it's good. You came to the right one
how would
because
you get them to work?
that's exactly what I wrote.
That's what he does.
So that's what I do. That's what I do.
Right there.
Here it is, proof you can do it. Okay, so
Read the book and find
read the book and find out. It's $10. Buy the book. It's a good example.
Next question.
Next question. No. So what I did was I had to really think about how it all worked. Okay, so the magic had to be very specific. So what I did was I used alchemy, because alchemy has metals and there's Tesla and sciencey and there's all that. So it's kind of a mix of both, right? And what I did was said that Daedalus, who's the main character, who is actually Daedalus from Greek mythology, still alive 2,000 years later, he has the secret of alchemy and knows how to create these things. So there's a line in the book where in this universe, it's an alternate universe. So in this universe, Edison died. He was killed. So because of Edison's death, Tesla rose to power. He also hooked up with a guy named Lowell in England, who was another fringe scientist, and they created the Tesla and Lowe organization. So they're a company, almost like GE, right? The reverse of Edison, right? And because of that, it changed the technology. We really didn't move into, gasoline and that sort of combustion engine.
Current.
Right. We went the other way, and everything is steampunk and the current that was pushed that way. And then I added in the alchemy part of it. And the alchemy kind of feeds into the supernatural thing. So in your setting, is your a you or is it another world? That's the big question.
It's a whole other world.
Okay, so it's
it's actually a group of characters in a guild. They go out and fight monsters and dragons and stuff like that.
So it sounds really cool. So what you need to do is you have a guild. Okay, so that guild can be the crux for starting this technology or this magic. So what they could do is maybe they find a certain chemical in their world that they can, utilize, and it powers things. But in order to power the things, they have to use magic to infuse the element or change the element in some way. And when they do, then that creates the technology. So it's a matter of
Like it shifts a ion or something.
yeah, it does an ion shift or it transmutes it to something else. So maybe like in one of my stories, not this one, but I have another one that they find pyrite in their world, which is fool's gold in our world, but they don't call it that in their world. But they found out that if the wizard accidentally cast a spell at someone and it hit the fool's gold, and it absorbed the magic and started to glow, then they realized, oh, that's weird. So then somebody started researching it, and they found out, oh, that you can power the stone by magic and then use it as a fuel. So they started putting it in, ships and this and that and weapons and all kinds of stuff. So it's a matter of just figuring out the science of it and making sure, again, that if your tables are floating in the beginning, they float at the end. So there's no right or wrong way to do it, but you're probably going to have to do some sort of transmutation to kind of get what you're going.
I'm trying to come up with stuff to make them work, and I just hadn't been able to come up with anything at all.
So what, and using a stone or using some sort of like precious gem or something like that will kind of help you kind of start in that direction, because there's always a mysticism. So what I would do is I would research gems, and I would research metals and totems and different things. You could have a totem with a gem inside that could power runes. Writing on something could give it power. You just need to kind of throw it against the wall and see what works for it. And it's possible because I've done it. So the best thing is research, get a good idea and throw it against the wall, and eventually it's going to stick. And just try out a couple things and see what works best for you. Get some friends to look at it, and I like that, or I don't like that, that doesn't make sense. That's what your readers and stuff are for. So it's not difficult, you just need to do your research.
Yeah, if you believe it, then you believe it.
Exactly, said correctly. Yes, in the mic.
Like starting off on the whole magic thing, how do you keep magic from being too overpowered, like too godlike?
So the answer is, and Robert, well, before he says it, I'm going to say it, there's a cost. Okay, so every power in your world has a cost. There's a price to pay. So if you have a price to pay, guess what? It'll never get too powerful.
Right, like I have witches in my story, and they literally have to pay with their life. So whatever spell they have to cast, it takes time off their life. So it could be minutes off their life, hours, years. So I make sure that it's limited, and they have to. And that's the thing. The other thing is they are forced to, because they will die if they do not cast these spells.
Like the candle. What was the movie about the falling star and choose a princess?
Stardust.
Stardust. Do you remember Michelle Pfeiffer was in that?
Yeah.
And for every spell that they cast, they
aged, yeah.
aged to take out.
So,
That's the price.
for the cost, never happened.
Yeah, nobody will have limitless power.
Right.
Or if you cast a spell, one of your loved ones dies.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Just
something. There has to be a
something.
limit.
There's a cost to magic because it is so unharnessed. Yeah. All right. So questions. Yes.
How do you properly showcase a transition in ideology or culture in the world?
So he gave a great example. The Handmaid's Tale is like a perfect example. We went from a democratic society. There was an explosion that caused this religious group to take over, and the ideology was changed through war.
It's happening right now.
Yeah.
We're slowly becoming a police state with these fractions where as long as there's riots, it justifies having the police take over because we have to maintain peace.
Right.
So
it's
the more riots you have, the more discontent you have, the more fracturing you have of a society, it justifies a change. So whether that changes from democracy into, police state and oligarchy or whatever, usually there has to be some fracture of a society, something so a meteorite that hits the planet.
There's a tipping point.
And you have to remember too that there is a mass media effect. So yes, in our world there is strife, and yes, there are groups and this and that, but believe it or not, the groups are very tiny. I think what ends up happening is the media, when they're looking for a story, they're going to say, "Oh, it was 10,000 people." Well, it was actually 10, right? So you have to be careful because, anyone it's like the old village thing. You lived in a small village, and something happened in the other part of town, and somebody comes running in your house going, "Oh my God, they're killing like hundreds of people." There's only 10 people in the village. How are they killing hundreds of people? So you have to be careful, right? So. Again, it's a narrative issue, right? So, yeah. So it's one of those things that you need to be careful of. So, when you're telling your stories, again, it's the same thing. There's going to be misinformation that in your story will occur to either start a revolution or start someone to go into a police state or something like that. Because it was like when we watched The Handmaid's Tale. My wife was watching it, and she works in the banking industry, and they went over this whole thing where they took women's accounts away and stuff like that. She goes, yes, it could happen, absolutely, but would it succeed? Probably not, right? Because eventually, like what would happen is that they transfer all the money to me as her husband. She's gonna withdraw that shit and give it to me, and then that's the end of it, right? Like that's the end of it. So you want it? Yeah, I have it. Just withdraw it, So there's certain things that you go, yeah, that's a great idea, but it doesn't hold a lot of weight because people are smarter than that, right? So, for every time a government institution or a financial institution puts a new policy in or does something like that, somebody's going to find a way around it because that's what we do. And keep in mind, this is one thing I want people to remember. When you're writing your stories and you're talking about the falls of society and stuff like that, you need to remember that Daedalus says it in the book. He says there's two things that move the world. Consumption and copulation. That's it. So we're either consuming, eating, buying, or we're out having sex.
We eat to breed or breed.
Yeah, so basically that's what's happening. So the reality is yeah, we have a democracy where people are doing things, and you can put that democracy in another world and try to make it fall. But the reality is that people are always going to want to eat. They're always going to want things, and even the people who have the most power, if you throw them into a police state, they lose everything. So no one's really going to kind of go that way. So you have to make sure that when you're building the fall of your world, that it kind of makes sense. Because The Handmaid's Tale, great story. Here's my problem with it. There's a woman who was buying things and doing things and had a great job, and it's over. Like, really? That fast? Probably not, right? What would happen is a slow fall and degradation of society. Eventually things would change. It would happen in small areas. And then I think The Handmaid's Tale would have been better if we would have gone, maybe her daughter was in the society and an adult. That to me makes much more sense. And maybe it was 2 generations out. That makes much more sense.
I mean, you could look at the fall of the Russian Empire, the
Exactly.
the French Empire, I know Marie Antoinette and all that. But if you look back at the history, it really started with Louis's father.
Exactly.
Hundreds of years. Yeah.
It took at least 1 or 2 generations before the fall actually happened.
Yeah, and here's the beauty of at least for now, of our society, is we got a 4-year span. So if they don't make the change in 4 years, someone's going to come along and push it all back, because, you know, that's pretty much how our society works, at least now. Someone's in power and they push an agenda for 4 years, then someone else comes in power and they push it back. So if you don't believe me, like I got, and I hate to get political, but it's important, because when you're writing, history and politics are important because they're in your world.
Well, everything's
everything's politics, everything's religion, everything's consumption. What was interesting was this young lady who's a writer, so I feel bad for her that she went down this road. She basically started saying all these things that current administration was putting into play, and that, oh my God, the world is ending and the world is over and this and that, blah blah blah. And I responded, you know what, you should really go back and really look at your history of what the last 2 or 3 administrations have done. If you would have gone back, you would have seen that the last administration banned people. And the administration before that banned people of certain groups. And if you go back, they banned certain people of certain groups. There was another bill that was passed by, and it's funny, it's a bill that between the 2 sides, one puts it in place, the other comes in and takes it out. Then they come back in office, they put it back. Then the other comes in and puts it out. So it's, you know, you have to, like, when you're doing your research, you're writers, and when you're citizens of the world, do your research. Just don't go off on a tangent and follow a herd off the cliff.
Don't be in an echo chamber.
Yeah, don't be an echo chamber. You know, you got to do your research, and as a writer, even more so. Because there's so much material out there that you can just literally look at one section of history and pull out so much information. There are so many films that have done, like one of my favorite films is The Color Purple. I mean, it's just an amazing film. You know, there was so much information and so much emotion and so much stuff that was in there. And then you look at a film like Glory, that was like amazing, a beautiful piece of film. And then there's a movie that's called the Torch Song Trilogy, which is a play and then something like that. I mean, beautiful story, right? And you can go through many different types of things and see, yeah, and it's just, you do your research, you find a conflict in history, you move it into a fantasy world, you move it into sci-fi, or you just retell that conflict a different way.
One thing might help you as you're building your culture, if you're going to mimic, let's say, the Greeks, but study the Greeks.
Exactly.
Exactly. Make it about a Greek culture that's like, but then don't mix it with, I don't know, Aztec.
Yeah, because it's not going to make sense. Again, you know, and if you do, have a good reason. Maybe the 2 live next to each other, and that's the conflict.
Well, or right, but my point is, because I do mix, like I mix, you know, sometimes, you know, 2 cultures that are similar.
Villain. Somebody who doesn't have to be somebody relatable, or just somebody interesting, somebody that, you know, just, I hate caricatures. I hate like over the top characters.
Over the top.
I want someone that is interesting. Like, okay, well, what is your motive? Oh, okay, that's, you know, as opposed to
like a cardboard.
Yeah.
Cookie cutter or cardboard, right?
Yeah,
he's dressed
like
in black.
two-dimensional.
Dressed in black, he's got, you know, he's got all,
Right. He's
yeah.
with the mustache.
Yes, they've got the pearl ring.
Well,
the
you
pearl
got-
ring, the
you got
cat,
the whole,
stroking the cat.
There are a couple of examples of the relatable villains that you're talking about. The movie 7.
Yeah.
Unbreakable.
Yep.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, so and it's interesting that you bring up Magneto, because Magneto is an interesting concept because of the concentration camp and all the stuff that he went through.
Yeah,
so that
he's a
that
Nazi
kind of put him in his position, right? How he viewed the world. So we talked about this in the villains and heroes panel earlier, that your villains and heroes, if you strip away that title, they're just people, right? And people have things that happen to them that make them do things. Like we see these shooters and mass murderers and these different people, and then we're like, how could they do this? And then you start, as Justin said, you start kind of going through their file, and you're like, okay, well, maybe I wouldn't have made that decision, but I kind of understand how you got there, and it's not relatable, but you kind of understand that. Like there's a famous line in a story called Dragonlance, and the character was a wizard, and he said that he became who he was because he was forged in a crucible of fire, like a sword, and because of that, that was who he was. That all these things happened to him that made him who he was. So that's your idea. As you create your villains and your heroes and the people of your story, things are going to happen to them. They're going to shape their what? Their physicality, their personal views, their religious views, and their rules to govern themselves by. Remember, a villain is nothing more than a hero with a different point of view. Because even people we think that are bats, they're doing something because they believe what they are doing is right.
Yeah, and your hero could be somebody else's villain.
Exactly. As quickly as someone's a hero, they could be a
Because we
villain.
talk about like an artist, George Washington is a hero, but from the British point of view, he was a terrorist. From our point of view, Benedict Arnold was a traitor, but from the British point of view, he was a traitor. There's a statue.
There's a statue of him in England. So
Christopher Columbus was
yeah.
considered a hero for many years.
Now he's vilified. So, again, it's perception and which side of the fence that you're standing on. You know what I mean?
And so, like, create the values and make them true for that character, and then the audience will
Figure it out.
Figure it out.
The audience will figure it out. All right, questions? Yes, in the back.
Oh, deferred.
Deferred.
Good.
I love it.
Pass it on.
How do you set up like a dark, suspenseful scene in the book?
So we put the lights up. Yeah. All right, so what you're asking is how do you create an air of suspense? How do you create? So how you do that, at least in our point of view, is you kind of set up the motion of events, right? And as this is how it works. It's very simple. As your character is moving through the world, you're telling the story as they're kind of seeing different parts, like, The Wizard of Oz. When Dorothy gets into the forest, right, when she hears all the noises and she kind of freaks out, and the lions, the tigers, the bear, why? We've kind of gone from this light. So as you notice, what happens in The Wizard of Oz, at least in the film, it goes from what? Light to dark and then light again. So Dorothy kind of passed from light into shadow and then back again. As you build up your suspense, especially running horror and these things, you've got to use the elements of darkness and light and different things and moving your character through the scene. So, like horror movies, what do they say? Don't go to sleep at 2 o'clock, or don't turn on the TV at 1 a.m. So you're setting the rules. So now, Gremlins, don't feed them after midnight. Mogwai. So you set some rules in place, and then you can kind of cue to that rule and kind of build that suspense, right? And we see it in like noir, where the old noirs, where you would see people say, "Don't go to that part of town, Sam." And Sam, where's he going? He's going to that part of town. So we've already kind of built up that thing. We all say, "Oh yeah." The horror movies, the 2 teenagers are going to go off and copulate in the forest in the dark. Well, okay, that's always a great idea. But we're building up that suspense that something may happen. When Harry Potter goes into the what? The Forbidden Forest. Don't go in the Forbidden Forest. It is forbidden. So now we've set up an air of suspense that literally, as Harry's walking towards the world is changing around him. And then when he gets to the forest, there's sounds, there's no light, there's creatures running around, hooting and howling, strange sounds. So you got to use elements around the character to set that up. And that's how you build the suspense. You kind of set this pace and you say, this is forbidden, this is a no-no, don't do this because there's a killer in the woods. You've got to set that up. Like a classic example, Little Red Riding Hood. It's a forest and there's wolves in the forest and there's wild animals and it was used to scare little children. So,
there's a tantric nature to what you're talking about. You want a scene that builds and builds and builds, and you have a real suspense, like makes people feel like nervous, it makes them feel anxious, it makes them feel anxiety. But But the whole thing with anxiety and nervousness like that on that level is that it is a slow build.
Yes.
It's not something where the guy jumps out at you and then the scene's over. You have to like have a lot of elements to kind of echo.
Right, and that's
the
kind of what I was
darkness.
leading to, is
Play the
that
fear note.
Exactly.
give the drops of fear and the drops of forbidden, and eventually you'll get that suspense that you're looking for.
Think about suspension of pleasure.
Sound, sight, make someone blind, make someone deaf, they can't hear, internal monologue, It's very easy, just you gotta, like Robert says, you gotta slow build. Yes, questions? Yes.
As far as endings go, how do you avoid writing like an ending that's not too predictable, but not like ridiculously over the top? Just
So
avoid
this is a good question, and it's tough, right? It's tough.
Beginnings and endings are always
Yes. So
I write a series, so I write everything.
we're all writing a series because we want to sell the next book.
I used to
But
write for television, and at the end of every episode, it had to be a cliffhanger, so they could tune in next week.
yes, on the next episode of Dragon Ball Z. So the answer to that question is tell your story until it's done, and if that requires you to kind of capsulate it to a cliffhanger and then move on to the next book, great. Good stories probably never end. Right? Look at something like, the Lord of the Rings, or even Star Wars, or Star Trek has been around for how long?
That's the one with the Vulcans?
That's the one with the Vulcans, not Darth Vader.
They started a new series.
They started a new series, and it's completely, told in a different way. And so again, good stories kind of live on, and bad stories kind of go away. And hopefully, Twilight never comes back. So and she, you know what? She did us all a favor. She put him in a house with a little baby with a white fence, and we said goodbye. Like a Hallmark episode, we left, right?
But I mean, have you watched or read any like a TV show and suddenly abruptly canceled? And you're like, no, what happened?
Yeah.
Don't
What?
do that.
Yeah, don't do that.
Don't do that.
Yes. Don't cut your fans off. And I wish they would have done that with some series out there, Twilight.
Well,
And,
Space 1999 is, for me, is a famous one. I don't need to show you probably.
I've seen it. You know about it.
Martin Landau, God rest his soul. Barbara Bain, Barry Morse, he's gone on. Catherine Schell. The moon was blown out of Earth orbit. 311 people trapped on the moon, and the series was about their adventure.
Right.
Well, suddenly season 1 ended, and then season 2 had like different cast members. Some of the old cast members were gone. We're like, where'd they go? And then suddenly that season just ended, and they're still trapped on the moon. The moon's still going out. What happened? Did they find another planet? What did they do? To this day, you go to Space 99 conventions, and that's the biggest thing. What happened to the Alphans that were trapped on the moon?
Yep. So one of the best books and comics and television series that has pretty much gotten away with murder is Doctor Who, because they can literally he reincarnates and they can continue and tell a completely different story, reboot him again. Now he's a woman. Yay! Finally. So, but now we're gonna have new adventures with the Doctor, and it's a woman, and we're gonna get a different perspective, and then maybe they'll keep her, maybe they won't. And they came up with the perfect formula. It's perfect. It's flawless. And guess what? No one else can do it now because it's so famous that it's theirs and no one's going to touch it. So that's the type of stuff when you get that lightning in a bottle where you have something that you can constantly reboot. I mean, it's been around for 60 years. So yeah. So me too. So it's like it's one of those things. So good stories never die. That's the point. 8:25. We got 5 minutes until they kick us out. Yes.
What are your opinions on stories that deal with like dual protagonists and stuff like that?
Dual protagonists. So, we've got plenty of stories like that. You've got like, if you're having protagonists against each other or working with each other.
Working with each other.
So you've got like Sherlock Holmes, and you've got different things where characters kind of work together throughout the whole series. I think it's interesting if you take a story like that, and then they've been working together for so many years, and then suddenly they're now at wit's end. So in my books, Daedalus is working with a woman called Nazrin Kaur, and Nazrin Kaur and him have many adventures, and everything's fine. They even have a romantic relationship, but then something happens that causes that to go south, and out of that going south, she kind of changes sides and becomes a villain. So now Daedalus is faced with someone that he knew very intimately, and someone that maybe he wronged, right? And now she's on the other side, but yet an ex-wife. And then essentially what ends up happening is that she still has feelings for him, and she's still like, hey, you know what? I'm not going to go back and do that thing anymore that you're doing, but I'll tell you what, this guy's a jerkball, and I will kind of keep you posted on him. But that only worked for so long, because eventually she became more and more under the spell of the other person that she was with. So that's an example of how you tear them apart, right? I mean, the new Sherlock series has been fantastic, and the relationship between Sherlock and Watson has just been amazing to watch, because you know, we always see them as you know, Sherlock and Watson and the pip cheerio, baby. They're always together, you know, and you're never gonna see them apart, and you know, with fisticuffs, you know, always together, living in an apartment. Right? So in this series, we see that they have real problems. You know, John was he has postpartum depression.
Yeah, no, he's got PTSD.
PTSD. So he's got PTSD, and he's dealing with that. Sherlock has his, you know, other stuff that and his drug addictions. So we explore all of that, which is fantastic, because if you were a fan of the series, now you're getting this whole new perspective.
Well, they actually twist the drug in the original series. He was seriously addicted to cocaine.
He was seriously addicted.
Like crazy.
Yeah,
but
opium and cocaine.
In the TV series, he uses it as a foil, as a vehicle for discovering things about underworld stuff. He has a reason.
Right.
It's not like reasonless.
So let's talk about. Go ahead, go and finish.
I was just saying, but they both have the same Moriarty is their common enemy.
Yeah, it's a common enemy. So there is a common enemy.
So in that regard, you can have them working together and disagree on certain things. But the one thing they do agree on.
Moriarty is bad. Right? So let's talk about stuff like Sherlock Holmes and stuff that you've seen on TV and go, oh, well, this has been around forever. Okay, well, there's something that's called public domain. Does everybody know what I mean when I say public domain? You can use it.
It's so old.
It's so old. It's past the 75-year mark. It's never been. Well, be careful, because there are societies that do own stuff. So Conan, even though it's been out long enough, is not public domain. There are certain things that fall into public domain, but you can't write anything new about Conan, because there's a group that owns him.
And
Tarzan
as well.
Tarzan's another one. The Edgar Rice Burroughs group owns Tarzan. I've actually spoken to them directly. The Phantom, another thing that's owned by King Features. Peter Pan is an interesting one. So Peter Pan was willed to the hospital, and we all saw the movie and how it happened. The interesting thing about that is, in England, you can't do Peter Pan. In the United States, you can, because the copyright laws do not carry over, right? So you can do new stories about Peter Pan in the United States, and Alice in Wonderland the same. Well, Alice in Wonderland is actually on both sides.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. So yeah, it's British too, but the weird one is Peter Pan, because the hospital has control of Peter Pan in England, so you can't do anything in England with Peter Pan, but you come over here and you can. Now, what does that mean? That means that you can't distribute your material in the UK, because the UK will slap you. Right? You can only do it in the United States.
So the books here, but not there.
Exactly. So that's why you saw stuff like Peter and the Star Searchers, and you saw the movie Pan, and you saw all these things that are Peter Pan stories. They can do that because they're not productions in the UK. If the story's not being told, you know, in their sort. So if you want to really play around with public domain stuff, the best place to go is Project Gutenberg. They're pretty clear about what is public domain and what is not. If you see it on Project Gutenberg, you probably mess with it. But before you do, check trademark and copyright laws. So just to give you an example, Mickey Mouse is very old, right? And he actually fell out of copyright, okay? And he wasn't really renewed properly. So what happens is that they did trademark on him. So trademark you can keep renewing, right? Every 10 years, boom, trademark, boom, trademark. So essentially they have control of Mickey Mouse. Not on copyright, but on trademark. So then what they do is that the original copyright is gone. So then they create a new Mickey story. Now they have copyright on Mickey Mouse again for that new story for 75 years. So that's why. Have you noticed something about Mickey Mouse? What's happened to him over the years? He's changed the way he looks. Okay, that's not because of artistic. That's because they're trying to keep the copyright. right? So Donald Duck, same thing. There's been changes over the years. And even with the superheroes, we've seen this slow dimensional change of the superheroes. Why? Because they're trying to keep the copyrights. So that's why they keep rebooting. That's why they keep doing these things, because eventually, after a certain time, the characters fall out of copyright, and then they're like, oh, we better do something real quick. That's why Batman's trademark, Superman's trademark, Grace Flynn is actually trademarked. I got a trademark on her. So the copyright laws are kind of weird. You can read about them on the internet, but you can use Alice in Wonderland. So just to give you, how many have you seen interpretations of Alice in Wonderland? Millions, right? Because most of them are horrible. But the reality is you can use Alice in Wonderland as a basis for your story. I mean, you can go down and they had what was a company that does the comics? They do the adult comics. You know what I'm talking about?
They did the whole series, Red Riding Hood, all
Red
that
Riding
stuff.
Hood. It's not Dark Horse. It's another company. But they have the really hot babe covers with the characters. You know what I'm talking
I
about?
bought one and I was
It's
ashamed of
garbage.
myself.
It was garbage.
I was like, why did I do that?
Yeah, over-sexualized, yeah, but it's garbage. I've read it. It's garbage. But they're a good. Yeah, Mr. Wolf. Hello.
Well, you're kind of like you're trying to critique porn.
It's not really porn. They try to pass it off as serious.
If it was porn, I'd have more respect for it.
No, are they coming? Where are they?
You got like 5 minutes.
Okay. Phil, that's Phil. I'm Phil. Meet Phil. He's awesome.
Hi, Phil.
He gave us 5 minutes. So let's sneak one more part. Okay, great. So thank you so much. If you're here tomorrow, we're actually located in the 400 row. You'll find us right on the end. If you're not here tomorrow and you're interested in picking up a book, we would ask that you kind of go outside to let the new panel come in and not disturb their brain power they're about to divulge to you. If you do like Jeff Carroll's in the back, he's an amazing writer and an amazing speaker, so you should definitely check out his stuff and we're going to turn it over to him now. So.
There's a 10-minute